He didn't slam the door. That's the part nobody talks about. Harold Metzger walked into the service office of Prout Brothers Farm Equipment on a gray Thursday morning in October of 1987, pulled a checkbook from the chest pocket of his canvas barn coat, and wrote out $4,012 without saying a single word. He set the check on the counter. He folded the checkbook back into his pocket. He looked Dale Prout dead in the eyes. And then he walked out of that building, got into his 1974 Ford F-250, and he never came back. Not once, not ever. And what happened in the years that followed, what rippled out from that quiet, devastating moment, is a story that the farmers of Grundy County, Iowa still talk about at the grain elevator. It is a story about what it costs a man not just in money, but in dignity. And it is a story about what an old farmer with grease under his fingernails knew, that a room full of younger, richer, louder men simply did not. Let me tell you about Harold Metzger. Picture Grundy County, Iowa in the autumn of 1987. The corn had come in late that year. A wet June had pushed everything back, and by October the fields were heavy and golden and cold, rows of dried stalks stretching out flat in every direction under skis the color of old pewter. The air smelled like diesel exhaust and turned earth, and the faint sweetness of silage drifting over from the dairy operation on County Road T38. Combine headers were running everywhere you looked. You could hear them across the fields, that deep, mechanical chewing sound, from a mile away if the wind was right. Grundy Center, the county seat, was a town of about 2,500 souls. There was a Casey's General Store, a Farmers State Bank branch, a John Deere dealership that had been operating since 1961, and a diner called Dots where the coffee was bad and the pie was outstanding and everybody knew your name and your business and probably your business before you did. Iowa agriculture in 1987 was still bleeding from the farm crisis. The early 1980s had been catastrophic for the Midwest. Land values had collapsed, interest rates had been punishing, and a wave of foreclosures had swept through counties like Grundy, leaving empty farmsteads and broken families and a kind of quiet grief that settled into the landscape like frost. By 87, things were recovering. Slowly, barely, farmers were cautious. They counted every dollar twice and every cent 3 times. A $4,000 repair bill was not an inconvenience. It was a wound. The Metzger farm sat on 280 acres off Grundy County Road F-47, about 9 miles northeast of Grundy Center. Third-generation land. Harold's grandfather Emil Metzger had broken that ground in 1919 with a team of Belgian draft horses. His father Walter had farmed it through the Depression without losing a single acre, a fact Harold spoke of with the kind of quiet reverence most men reserve for scripture. And Harold himself had worked that land for going on 38 years by the time our story takes place. Harold Metzger was 61 years old in the fall of 1987. He was a lean man, but not a thin one, the kind of lean that comes from a life of physical work rather than a lack of food. His hands were remarkable. Thick across the knuckles, stained permanently at the cuticles with a darkness that soap could no longer touch, with fingers that moved with a kind of slow precision when he handled machinery, the way a piano player's hands move when they're thinking. His face was deeply lined, sun-darkened, framed by a fringe of steel-gray hair that stuck out from under a John Deere cap so old the green had faded to something closer to sage. He had not finished high school. This is worth saying plainly because it mattered to certain people in Grundy County, and the way it mattered to them tells you everything you need to know about those people. Harold had left school in 1943 at the age of 17 when his father suffered a heart attack, and he had never gone back. What he had done instead was read voraciously, almost obsessively, every farm journal, every technical manual, every service bulletin he could get his hands on. He subscribed to 3 different agricultural engineering publications. He had the complete factory service manuals for every piece of major equipment he had ever owned, stacked in a bookshelf he'd built himself in the corner of his machine shed, organized by make and year. He was not a man who talked much about what he knew. Harold ran a corn and soybean operation that was modest by 1987 standards, 280 owned acres, another 120 rented from a widow named Estelle Borchers who trusted Harold implicitly because he had never once given her a reason not to. He ran lean equipment, older equipment, and he maintained it with the kind of meticulous care that meant his machines outlasted anything they had a right to outlast. His wife, Patricia Patty, taught 3rd grade at Grundy Center Elementary and sang in the First Methodist Choir on Sunday mornings. They had 2 children, a daughter, Joanne, who was studying nursing up in Waterloo, and a son, Mark, who was the first Metzger in 3 generations to leave farming, a fact Harold had accepted with more grace than anyone expected. He was not a dramatic man. He was not a man given to speeches or confrontations or grand gestures. Which is why when Harold Metzger finally walked away, it meant something. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever walked into a place of business and known, almost immediately, that you were being looked at as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped? That particular feeling, the slight pause before they smile, the way the smile doesn't quite reach the eyes, you know it when you feel it. Harold knew it. Dale Pruitt was the service manager at Pruitt Brothers Farm Equipment. He was, to be clear, not a bad man in the way that the worst people are bad. He was something more common and in many ways more damaging. He was a comfortable man who had never been made uncomfortable enough to become better. His father, Roy Pruitt, had founded the dealership. Dale had grown up in it, learned the business from the demand side rather than the supply side, which is to say he had learned to sell and to charge rather than to fix and to understand. He was 43 years old, heavy-set with a round face that defaulted to a kind of cheerful condescension, the look of a man who was always on the verge of explaining something to you that you hadn't asked about. He drove a new 1987 GMC Sierra in two-tone burgundy and silver. He wore Wrangler jeans pressed sharp enough to cut paper, and a Pruitt Brothers Equipment polo shirt tucked in with a Western belt that had his name tooled on the back. He called everyone Bud or Buddy or Pal, which sounds friendly until you notice he used all three words interchangeably regardless of how well he knew you. Dale had not, as best anyone could recall, ever personally repaired a piece of farm equipment in a professional capacity. He had hired men who could do that, and in fairness, one of those men, his senior technician, a quiet fellow named Terry Novick, was genuinely skilled. But Terry's skills were not the issue. Dale's judgment of what those skills ought to cost, that was the issue. The dealership itself was prosperous. The building on Highway 14 was newer than anything around it, with a glass showroom up front showing 3 brand new John Deere machines that smelled of fresh paint and optimism. The service bay in the back smelled of something more familiar, hydraulic fluid and tire rubber and the particular tang of metal that has been getting hot and then cold for a very long time. Harold had bought parts there for years. He had never been a warranty customer. His equipment was too old for that, but he had been a steady, reliable, cash-paying customer. That is to say, he was exactly the kind of customer a smart man would take care of. Dale Pruitt was not, in this one specific respect, a smart man. The trouble began in the last week of September, 1987. Harold's primary field tractor, a 1968 John Deere 4020 in power shift configuration, serial number T213R something, painted that particular shade of green that John Deere had been using since before Harold's father was born, began showing symptoms that Harold recognized immediately. The hydraulic system was weeping. Not gushing, weeping. A slow seep at the rear rockshaft, the hydraulic cylinder that controlled the 3-point hitch, which in turn controlled every implement Harold pulled behind that tractor. During a morning of disking, Harold had noticed the hitch drifting downward under load, the implement slowly losing its set. He had climbed down, walked around to the back, knelt in the dirt, and run his thumb along the lower edge of the rockshaft housing. He had known what he was feeling before his thumb found it. The rockshaft seal, a simple rubber O-ring and wiper seal assembly. On a 4020, replacing it requires pulling the rockshaft cover, a job that takes time and some patience but is not, by any mechanical measure, a complicated repair. Harold had done it twice before, once in 1974 and once in 1979. He knew exactly what parts were needed. A rockshaft seal kit, part number AR53632 as listed in the TM1037 technical manual on his shelf. At current 1987 dealer pricing, that kit retailed for approximately $50 to $70. The job, for a competent technician, was 4 to 6 hours of labor. Harold was in the middle of harvest. He had a 1,400-acre corn crop to get in, his own ground plus several neighbor fields he custom harvested to make ends meet. He did not have time to pull his tractor apart himself, not right now, not with the weather window closing and the corn standing in the field. So he did something he almost never did. He called Pruitt Brothers. He spoke with Dale Pruitt directly. He described the symptom, hydraulic seep at the rockshaft, and he said, carefully and clearly, that he believed it was the rockshaft seal. He asked Dale to have Terry Novick look at it and give him a quote. "Bud, don't you worry," Dale had said. "We'll get her squared away. I'll have Terry look her over top to bottom, make sure there's nothing else going on." Harold had paused at that phrase, top to bottom, but he was busy and he trusted that a man running a reputable dealership would not do what Harold was now afraid Dale Pruitt was about to do. He dropped the 40/20 off on a Monday morning. He called Wednesday. Dale told him they were still diagnosing. He called Friday. Dale told him they'd found the problem, hydraulic system issues, needed some work, and that the bill was coming together. He'd have a number by Monday. Harold borrowed a neighbor's Oliver $16.50 to finish the week's work. He tried not to think about it. Monday, Dale called him. The bill, he said, was going to be $4,012. There was a silence on the line. Harold asked him to break it down. Dale itemized it over the phone in the cheerful voice of a man reading a grocery list. Labor, $1,800. Hydraulic pump rebuild, $940. New hydraulic filter housing assembly, $680. Miscellaneous seals and gaskets, $420. Parts markup and shop supplies, $172. Harold listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he asked one question: did you replace the rockshaft seal? Oh, that was part of the work, yeah, bud, all tied together. I see, Harold said. I'll be in Thursday morning. And he was. Let me ask you something right now, before we go any further. If you had just been told your repair bill was $4,000 and you were 90% certain that the actual problem was a $70 seal, what would you do? Would you argue? Would you raise your voice? Would you walk out and call a lawyer? Watch what Harold Metzger does, because it is not any of those things. Here's what Harold Metzger knew. He knew it the moment Dale read him that bill over the phone, and he confirmed it that Thursday morning when he arrived at Pruitt Brothers 30 minutes before the service office opened and stood at the window of the service bay looking at his tractor. He knew it because Harold Metzger had rebuilt the hydraulic system on a John Deere 40/20 twice in his life, once with his father standing next to him in 1965 and once alone in 1979, and he knew that machine the way a doctor knows the body of a patient he has treated for 30 years. The hydraulic pump on a 1968 40/20 power shift, a gear-driven pump feeding the transmission and hydraulic system, is not a component that fails quietly. When a 40/20 hydraulic pump fails or degrades significantly, you feel it in the transmission response, in the steering effort, in the cycle time of every hydraulic function. Harold's tractor had shown none of those symptoms. The hitch had been the only issue, just the hitch, drifting slowly under load. That is the singular, classic, textbook symptom of a leaking rockshaft seal. A hydraulic pump rebuild, nearly $1,000 on Dale's invoice, was not something Harold's tractor had needed. Harold was nearly certain of this, but nearly was not certain. So Harold had done something the night before his Thursday morning visit. He had gone into his machine shed, opened TM-1037, the factory technical manual for the 40/20, to the hydraulic system diagnostic section, and he had read, for perhaps the 5th or 6th time in his life, the procedure for pressure testing the 40/20's hydraulic circuit. He had written 3 numbers on a notepad and put it in his shirt pocket. He had also, while he was in the shed, checked a 1987 parts catalog that his neighbor Glenn Hofstetter had left behind after borrowing Harold's floor jack. The AR-53632 rockshaft seal kit, listed retail price $62.40. When Dale arrived and unlocked the service office at 7:45 that morning, Harold was already standing at the counter. He had the invoice Dale had mailed him. He had his notepad, and he had TM-1037 under his arm. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone of anything. He simply said, "Dale, I'd like to talk through this bill with you before I pay it, and I'd like Terry to be here if that's all right." Terry Novick appeared from the service bay, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He was a quiet man in his late 30s with the slightly hunched posture of someone who spent most of his life bent over machinery. He did not quite meet Harold's eyes right away. That told Harold something. Harold opened the manual to the hydraulic diagnostic section. He placed his notepad on the counter beside it. "The charge is for a hydraulic pump rebuild," Harold said. "Before I pay for that, I'd like to know what the before and after pressure readings were. The spec for the 40/20 system relief is 2,250 psi. If the pump was bad enough to rebuild, you'd have seen significantly low readings, below 1,800. I'm guessing you didn't, because the transmission behavior was normal when I brought it in. The service bay was very quiet. Dale opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Terry. Terry looked at the floor. And that look, that specific, brief, down-at-the-floor look, told Harold everything he needed to know. There had been no pressure test. There had been no pump rebuild, or if there had been a pump rebuild, it had not been because the pump needed it. What Harold knew that Dale apparently had not considered was this. A man who has read the factory service manual cover to cover not once but many times over many years does not forget what he has read. The knowledge lives in him the way the smell of rain on dry earth lives in you, permanently and without effort. It does not require him to be credentialed. It does not require him to have a sign on a building. It simply requires that he paid attention. Harold had always paid attention. What happened next lasted less than 4 minutes, but it has been described in Grundy County for nearly 40 years as if it lasted much longer. Dale Pruitt tried to hold his position. He said something about diagnostic time and shop policy and how sometimes you couldn't know what a hydraulic system needed until you were inside it. His voice had taken on a different quality, still loud but slightly hollow, the way a confidence sounds when it has lost its footing. Harold listened to all of it. Then he picked up TM-1037 and set it open, facing Dale and Terry, to page H10, the rock shaft seal replacement procedure. He put his finger on the parts list at the bottom of the page. AR 53632, $62.40. He said, "Terry, how many hours did you have in the rock shaft seal itself?" Terry looked at the floor again, then he looked up. He was a decent man in a difficult position. He said quietly, "About 3 hours." Harold nodded. He did the math on his notepad in 30 seconds. 3 hours of labor at the shop rate. Dale had given him a $42 per hour, $126. Seal kit, $62.40. A reasonable parts markup, say 30%, $81. Call it $210 for the whole job. He wrote $210 on his notepad and pushed it across the counter. "I'm not saying that's what this bill should have been," Harold said. "I'm saying that's what the work appears to have been." Dale's face had gone through several colors in the past 3 minutes. He now appeared to be trying to recover some version of his normal cheerful authority. He said that the additional charges reflected the inspection of other components, the diagnostic time, the shop's policy of doing a complete system review. Harold said, "I didn't ask for a complete system review. I told you specifically what the problem was when I called." "Now, bud, that's not." "My name is Harold," Harold said, not angrily, just clearly. The silence after that was the loudest thing in the building. Terry Novick later told Glenn Hofstadter, who told most of the rest of the county at Dot's Diner within approximately 72 hours, that in his 12 years as a technician, he had never felt a silence quite like the one that followed Harold Metzger saying his own name in that service office. Dale Pruitt looked at the invoice. He looked at Harold. He looked at Terry, who was suddenly very busy studying the middle distance. Dale made a decision. He said the bill stood. He said it was itemized and legitimate, and that if Harold had any concerns, he was welcome to take them to John Deere's Regional Customer Relations Office. He said it with his chin up and his hands flat on the counter, which was the posture of a man who believed that his position in that room, behind the counter, with the invoice in his pressed Wranglers and his name on the back of his belt, made him right. Harold looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with contempt, with something that was much harder for Dale to absorb, a kind of patient, exhausted understanding of who Dale Pruitt was and who Dale Pruitt was always going to be. Then Harold Metzger pulled out his checkbook. He wrote the check for $4,012, the full amount, every penny, and laid it on the counter. He said, "I want the old parts back, everything you replaced." This was his legal right. Under Iowa law, a customer requesting replaced parts must be given them. Dale nodded and said he'd have Terry box them up. Harold waited. Terry brought a cardboard box out of the service bay 8 minutes later. Harold put it in the bed of his truck. He drove home. He went into his machine shed. He opened the box. Inside was one rockshaft seal kit, the rubber O-ring and wiper seal assembly, dried out and cracked. The hydraulic pump was not in the box. When Harold called back and asked about it, he was told the pump had been core returned as part of the rebuild process. There was no rebuilt pump to return, of course, because there had been no pump rebuild. Harold already knew this. The box had told him everything he needed to know before he ever made the call. He made the call only so that it would be noted, so that it would be on the record of that conversation somewhere that he had asked. He hung up the phone. He sat for a long moment in his machine shed in the smell of oil and metal and old grain dust, with the single failed seal kit in the cardboard box in front of him and his TM-1037 on the shelf behind him. Then he did something that Patty Metzger later said was the most quietly frightening thing she had ever seen her husband do. He got a legal pad. And he began to write, "Now I want to ask you, do you see what's happening here?" Harold didn't threaten. He didn't post a review. He didn't call a lawyer. He wrote on a legal pad, "I want you to think about what a man with Harold Metzger's patience and precision would write on that legal pad," because it wasn't a complaint. It was something much more powerful. The silence in this story didn't happen in a room. It happened over the next 18 months, and it was a silence made of absences. Harold Metzger did not return to Pruitt Brothers equipment, not for parts, not for service, not to browse the showroom in the winter, not for any reason. His truck did not turn into that parking lot again. This would have been noticeable enough on its own. Harold had been a customer there for going on 22 years. He was not a big customer. He wasn't buying new machines, but he was the kind of customer that a small-town dealership depends on in the spaces between big sales. The steady parts buyer, the occasional service customer, the man who would stop in for a hydraulic filter or a set of belts or a new draw pin. But Harold had done something on that legal pad. He had made a list of every farmer he knew, neighbors, custom harvest clients, members of the County Farm Bureau chapter, men he sat near at church, men he'd helped with equipment over the years, and beside each name he had written a number, roughly how many dollars per year that person might spend at a dealership. Not to be precise, just to think it through. He counted 41 names. He estimated total annual parts and service spending across those 41 operations at somewhere between $180,000 and $240,000. Harold didn't call a meeting. He didn't write a letter to the editor. He didn't go to the Farm Bureau and make a speech. He simply told the truth when people asked. And people asked because Harold Metzger was the kind of man whose opinion about a dealership meant something. When Glenn Hofstadter's son asked Harold where he should take his 4240 for a hydraulic issue, Harold told him what had happened, start to finish, calmly and completely with the numbers. Glenn's son drove 42 miles to a different dealer in Conrad. When the Borcher's boy, Estelle's nephew, farming her ground by then, asked Harold about Pruitt Brothers, Harold told him the same story. He drove to Conrad too. Word moved the way it always moves in a small county. Not like a broadcast, but like water, finding its own level, filling in around things. By the spring of 1989, there were at least a dozen farming operations in Grundy County that had quietly redirected their business away from Pruitt Brothers. Dale Pruitt likely did not connect the dots all at once. He probably noticed the individual absences before he understood the pattern. A good customer who stopped coming in, then another. Then another. But Dale was a man who believed that his position made him right, and men who believe that tend to be the last to understand what their position has actually cost them. The 1990s were hard years for independent farm equipment dealerships in rural Iowa. The industry was consolidating. John Deere was pushing dealers toward larger territories and higher sales volumes, which meant smaller single-location dealerships were under enormous pressure. The ones that survived were the ones with loyal customer bases, the ones that had spent decades treating people the way people deserved to be treated, so that when the market got hard and the margins got thin, their customers stayed. Pruitt Brothers Equipment sold the dealership in 1994. Dale Pruitt retired to Arizona. The building on Highway 14 went through 2 more owners before it was eventually converted into a farm supply warehouse with no service bay at all. I am not telling you this to suggest that Harold Metzger single-handedly destroyed a dealership. That would be too simple, and Harold himself would have hated that telling of the story. The farm equipment market was brutal in the 1990s, and the Pruitt dealership had other problems that had nothing to do with Harold. Consolidation would have put pressure on them regardless. But I will tell you this. Several of the farmers who had redirected their business after hearing Harold's story went on to establish long-term relationships with the dealer in Conrad. When that dealer needed to justify a branch expansion into northern Grundy County in 1996, the book of business he could point to in that area, the steady parts and service revenue from farms that had been redirected there over the preceding decade, was part of the case he made. The expansion happened. The location is still operating today. And the 1968 John Deere 4020. Harold ran it until 2001, 33 years after it was built. When he finally stopped farming the home ground, he was in his mid-70s. Mark had come back and was leasing the land, and Harold's knees had finally announced that enough was enough. Harold didn't sell the 4020. He pushed it into the back of the machine shed, covered it with a canvas tarp he'd oiled himself, and told Mark it was not for sale at any price. Mark Metzger still has it. It runs. He started it 2 Julys ago just to hear it. It started on the 4th turn of the key. There is one more thing worth telling. In 2003, a young man named Kevin Strauss bought a rundown 85-acre operation in eastern Grundy County and was trying to get his footing in the county's farming community. He had an old tractor, a late 1960s Oliver 1655, with hydraulic problems he couldn't diagnose. Someone pointed him toward Harold Metzger. Harold was 77 years old. He walked out to Kevin's place one afternoon in early June, looked at the Oliver for about 4 minutes, ran the hitch through its cycle twice, and told Kevin it was the rockshaft seal. He said the seal kit would run about $80 from any decent dealer. He said the job would take a skilled mechanic 4 or 5 hours. He said Kevin should get one competitive quote, then get a second one, and that if the second quote was more than twice the first, Kevin should drive to whichever dealer gave him the second quote and shake his hand and drive away and never go back. Kevin asked Harold how he knew so much about old hydraulic systems. Harold said, "I read the manuals." Kevin Strauss is still farming that ground. He's now at 320 acres. He told me, and by me I mean the spirit of this channel, the keeper of these stories, that Harold Metzger's advice saved him from a bad experience in his very first year of independent farming. He said he has thought about it many times. He said Harold told him something else that afternoon, standing next to that old Oliver in the June light, that he has never forgot. He said Harold told him, "There are 2 things that will tell you everything you need to know about a man or a business. The first is how they treat you when something goes wrong. The second is whether they think you'll notice." Kevin said he didn't fully understand the second part until he'd been farming for about 10 years. Then he said he understood it completely. Let me ask you one last thing. What does it mean to walk away? We often think of walking away as a defeat, as something done in anger or exhaustion or helplessness, the last act of a man who has lost. But Harold Metzger's walk out of Prout Brothers that October morning was none of those things. It was a man who had done the arithmetic. He understood with perfect clarity what that room contained and what it did not contain. It did not contain anyone who was going to suddenly understand the TM1037, or the pressure specifications of the 4020 hydraulic circuit, or the meaning of asking a customer's name back to a man who had just told you his name. No argument Harold could make in that room was going to produce the outcome that reality had already determined. So he paid the bill. He paid it because it was the honest thing to do with a signed invoice. He paid it because he was not a man who left debts. He paid it because leaving a debt would have given Dale Prout a grievance, and Harold did not want to give Dale Prout anything, not an argument, not a grievance, not even the satisfaction of a raised voice. He paid it and then he left. And leaving, quietly, completely, permanently, was the most powerful thing Harold Metzger ever did in a business context. Not because it punished Dale Prout. Harold was not a man who thought in terms of punishment, but because it was the only response that was entirely, perfectly true to who Harold Metzger was. He did not need to win the argument in that room. He was already winning a longer argument, one that would play out over decades and would be graded not by any judge or jury, but by the simple accounting of who had built something real and who had not. Harold Metzger farmed his family's land for 56 years. He lost nothing he did not choose to lose. He left something behind that outlasted the building on Highway 14 and the pressed Wranglers and the two-tone GMC Sierra. He left behind a reputation for saying what he knew and knowing what he said. He left behind a way of treating people with precision and honesty and without the theater of false emotion that Kevin Strauss has carried into his own operation, and that Mark Metzger practices on that same 280 acres where Emil Metzger first broke ground in 1919. There is an old idea in farming, older than tractors, older than combines, older than the John Deere Company itself, that the land does not care about your feelings. The land cares about what you do. You can be angry at a drought or a flood or a market price, and the land will register none of it. What the land registers is whether you showed up, whether you did the work correctly, whether you understood what was in front of you. Harold Metzger understood what was in front of him his whole life. A cracked rubber seal, weeping slowly in the cold October morning of 1987. He knew what it was, he knew what it cost, he knew what it meant. He wrote the check, he walked out the door. And then he went home and got back to work. Because the corn doesn't wait, and neither does a man who knows who he is. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been in a room where someone thought you didn't know, and you did, leave a comment below. These stories belong to all of us. Subscribe to The Forgotten Farmer, new stories every week. Historical context and setting are real. The John Deere 4020, part number AR53632, the TM1037 technical manual, Grundy County, Iowa, the Iowa farm crisis of the 1980s, John Deere dealer consolidation patterns of the 1990s, and the hydraulic specifications referenced are all accurate. Characters, names, dialogue, and specific events are dramatized for storytelling purposes.